This is a message to the people of Lebanon.
The defense minister had been pressing for 3 months for a massive invasion of the Lebanon. The plan would not be for a limited operation, but for one which might go all the way to Beirut.
Cross to have been buried in massive Sabra and Shatila, a large plot of unmarked graves.
Today's murderous attacks on the Marine headquarters and a building housing
These
French
deeds
troops.
make so evident the bestial nature of those who would assume
U.S.
power.
intelligence is particularly concerned that Hezbollah, a sworn enemy of the U.S. and Israel,
today amongst Christians,
we're going to get to go into Lebanon.
יהפוך את ביירות ואת דרום לבנון, לא רחוק מכאן, לעזה.
Personal wireless devices exploded.
تبريكات للتعازي باستشهاد الأمين العام السيد حسن نصر الله.
Has been killed.
Hezbollah is not out, but it's really down. It's clobbered. Their leadership has been decimated.
Hezbollah is a menace to the Lebanese state.
It's called Resolution 1559, where the disarming of
Despite
Hezbollah.
the setbacks, Hezbollah has demonstrated its capabilities to
Israeli
Israeli
Security Cabinet agreeing to end the fighting with Hezbollah.
To accept the ceasefire is a major blow to Israel.
The Litani
Rebel
River.
forces in Damascus have declared the capital city.
Can Hezbollah rebuild itself?
Do you remember when your country was called the Pearl of the Middle East? I do. So what happened to Lebanon?
This is a Lebanon often romanticized in the late 60s and 70s, a destination for seaside tourism and cosmopolitan life. But this image is only part of the story. Beneath the surface, there was a far more complex and painful reality.
For some, the honey is not so sweet.
Lebanon was a country trying to hold itself together, often called a mosaic, a place where Christians, Sunnis, Shiites, and Druze all coexisted. But this mosaic was anything but harmonious. The Christians, especially the Maronites, held most of the power. Their dominance, a legacy of the French Mandate, had created deep divides, while Lebanon's Shiite community was left on the fringes. The Shiites, concentrated in the rural south and the Bekaa Valley, lived in poverty. They were Lebanon's forgotten population, struggling with poor infrastructure, minimal health care, and a lack of education. In a country built on power sharing, they were almost invisible. The Shiites weren't alone in the south, though. Sharing this space were Palestinian refugees who had arrived decades earlier. When Israel was established by the United Nations in 1948, it wasn't just about drawing new borders. It displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, forcing them to flee. Uprooted from their homes, many sought refuge in neighboring Arab countries, with a significant number heading north into Lebanon. This wasn't a temporary situation. Palestinian refugees settled into camps. The Nakba wasn't over for the Palestinians, and the echoes of that disaster would soon ripple through Lebanon and the entire region. In 1967, the Arab world faced a crushing defeat against Israel. In just 6 days, Israel's military swept across the region, leaving a trail of stunned and defeated Arab army in its wake. Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, and the Sinai Peninsula now fell under Israeli control. This victory not only solidified Israel's dominance, but also marked the end of Nasser's pan-Arab nationalist movement. For years to come, Egypt and Jordan would remain neutralized, sidelined from any confrontation with Israel. Lebanon, however, took a different path, remaining neutral during the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. General al-Bostani, the Lebanese army chief, refused to open a new front along Lebanon's borders with Israel. The Lebanese had long embraced what they called Lebanon's strength in weakness. They thought that by positioning itself as the Switzerland of the Middle East, Lebanon could avoid conflict, but this belief would soon prove tragically misguided. Under pressure from regional powers, Lebanon was forced to sign the Cairo Agreement with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat. This wasn't a decision Lebanon made freely. The agreement was signed between the PLO and General Bostani, allowing them to establish bases along Lebanon's borders, particularly within the refugee camps in southern Lebanon. 1 year later in 1970, after being expelled from Jordan during Black September, the PLO fully relocated its operations to southern Lebanon, home to a Shia majority. Tensions escalated between the PLO and Israel, turning southern Lebanon into a battleground. Israeli forces frequently launched air raids against PLO positions, with skirmishes along the border escalating into full-blown battles.
Insisting to escalate more and more. We haven't any choice. It is our home.
As the violence intensified, the already weakened Lebanese state was powerless to intervene. The situation worsened in 1975 when Lebanon plunged into civil war, a conflict that would last 16 years. The Lebanese Civil War saw Israel ally with the Christian phalangists, paving the way for direct Israeli intervention.
The Israelis have allies, the phalangists, an extreme right-wing militia which controls the Christian villages dotted along Lebanon's southern edge.
Lebanon was no longer a bystander. It was becoming the front line in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1978, Israel launched Operation Litani, its first major invasion of Lebanon.
The invasion of Lebanon began in the early hours of the 15th of
Their
March.
goal was to drive the PLO north of the Litani River and create a buffer zone to protect its northern towns.
Israel had captured almost all of South Lebanon except the city of Tyre, up to the edge of the Litani River, an area of 500 square miles or more.
The operation was swift and it was brutal. Thousands of Lebanese civilians, mostly Shiites, were displaced. For the Shia population, this invasion was a wake-up call. Their homes were destroyed, their families scattered, and their government nowhere to be seen.
Nobody is coming to help us. We have no bread, no food, not even water, no electricity, nothing. We are alone. We have nothing. We need everything, you see. We are in south of Lebanon alone, and we have no fucking government.
Southern Lebanon was left to fend for itself. In this vacuum of power, something began to stir. The seeds of resistance were being planted.
Another invasion?
Come on, it's not an invasion. We walked in and we're walking out. But if you want to call it an invasion, you're welcome. But,
On June 1982, Israel launched its second invasion of Lebanon, aiming to end the PLO's presence in the country entirely. This time, however, the invasion extended beyond the southern regions, pushing deep into Lebanon's heart. Beirut, once crafted by European powers to be the Paris of the Middle East, had now become a war zone. The PLO's stronghold was supposed to be the primary target, but Israel's aggressive military tactics spared no one. Within days, Israeli forces had reached Beirut's outskirts, and by August, after weeks of siege and intense international pressure, the PLO negotiated an evacuation and left the capital. But this was only the beginning. With the PLO gone, Israeli troops pushed further into West Beirut, tightening their hold on the city. In mid-September, the situation took a horrific turn. As the world watched, Lebanese Christian militias, supported by Israeli forces, entered the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. The militias unleashed a massacre. Thousands of Palestinian civilians, women, children, and the elderly were brutally slaughtered.
In the morning, these people came and...
Who are these people? From the Kataib, you mean?
Yes, the leader is Bashir Jmaï.
While the Christian militias carried out the attacks, many believed Israel's hands were behind this atrocity. In the wake of Israel's invasion, southern Lebanon was devastated. The Shiite communities, already enduring years of poverty and marginalization, now faced the harsh reality of occupation. With the PLO driven out, Israeli forces expanded their occupation across Lebanon, establishing a firm stronghold in the south. Meanwhile, Christian phalangists, with the blood of massacre on their hands and backed by Western allies, seized control of the government.
Can rely upon the help of the United States. It is my
Soon after, U.S. Marines and French troops arrived on Lebanese soil as so-called peacekeepers.
The presence of 800 Marines in Beirut will stabilize the situation.
This felt like a layered occupation. Israel in the south, a complicit government in power, and foreign troops on their soil. They faced a choice: remain passive and risk more suffering, or rise to defend their land. Within days of Israel's invasion, approximately 1,500 Iranian voluntary forces made their way into Lebanon through Syria, not to take control, but to offer their support as allies. Inspired by their recent revolution and Ayatollah Khomeini's call to resist oppression, these fighters offered tactical training. They shared hard-won strategies to strengthen Lebanon's Shiite resistance, which had gained momentum under leaders like Musa Sadr, who had founded the Amel movement in the mid-70s. This support was essential but limited. Iran was already facing a brutal war with Iraq after Saddam Hussein's invasion, and fighting on two fronts was unsustainable. Ayatollah Khomeini, aware of these pressures, advised against a prolonged Iranian presence. He insisted that the Lebanese should lead their own resistance. The Iranian volunteers respected this, eventually stepping back in a handover, leaving behind a capable local force. This foundation of support laid the groundwork for what would soon become the Islamic resistance in Lebanon, which would be later known as Hezbollah, the Party of God. As Hezbollah's influence grew, so did its tactics. Through unconventional warfare, they made the occupation costly, targeting both Israeli and U.S. positions.
American peacekeeping forces devastated in Hezbollah. 4 months later, the Americans withdrew, unwilling to sustain such losses in a country where every hand was against them.
In 1989, the TAIF Agreement brought an official end to Lebanon's long and brutal civil war. It called for the disarmament of all militias to restore sovereignty and order, with one exception. Hezbollah was allowed to remain armed to fight the Israeli occupation and liberate the south, as outlined in the agreement. The 1990s became Hezbollah's foundation years, a period of rebuilding, organizing, and strengthening. Israel, however, believed it could crush this emerging force, confident that targeting its leadership would bring Hezbollah to its knees. In February 1992, Hezbollah's Secretary General, Saeed Abbas Mousavi, was traveling with his family when his convoy came under a sudden lethal attack. An Israeli helicopter gunship ambushed them, and in a barrage of rockets, he was killed along with his wife and young son.
It was accidental. We wanted to kill the terrorists themselves and their leaders, not their families, but that happens in any kind of warfare.
It was a move meant to break Hezbollah's morale by taking down one of its most respected leaders.
And their capacity to attack us have changed dramatically. We will be able to defend ourselves better. They will be able to hit us not as effectively because the organizing brain has been removed.
But Israel's strategy backfired. The assassination didn't weaken Hezbollah. Instead, it paved the way for its new leader, Israel's worst nightmares for decades to come. Saeed Hassan Nasrallah, a young charismatic leader, rose to take Mousavi's place. Under his leadership, Hezbollah became more disciplined, more strategic, setting the stage for a new era of resistance and its most defining victories.
From now on in Lebanon, May the 25th will be a holiday, the National Day of Resistance and Liberation, to celebrate the departure of the Israelis from the south.
May 2000. After years of persistent resistance, Hezbollah achieved what no Arab force had done before. They forced Israel to withdraw completely from southern Lebanon. Through years of organized and determined resistance, they made the occupation unbearable for Israel, ultimately driving them off occupied Lebanese land.
At Fatima Gate. Until now, the Israeli army's main gate celebrates the departure of the Israelis from the south.
Hezbollah fighters walked back into their towns as heroes, and for a moment, sectarian lines blurred as Lebanese citizens from all backgrounds joined in the victory.
The Hezbollah movement mingling with ordinary people who have, after 22 years, been able to return to their hometowns and villages.
It was a rare unifying chapter for the country. But as Hezbollah's influence grew, so did the questions about its role in Lebanon's future.
Une explosion terrible. Quelques minutes plus tard, la mort de l'ancien Premier ministre Rafik Hariri était annoncée.
February 14th, 2005, Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri was killed in a massive blast in downtown
Valentine's
Beirut.
Day took a tragic turn for Lebanon. A massive explosion tore through Beirut, shattering buildings and lives. Rafik Hariri, Lebanon's former prime minister, was assassinated along with 21 others. His assassination rocks the country, igniting a wave of grief and outrage that quickly turned into action. Fingers pointed at Syria and its young leader, Bashar al-Assad, as Hariri had been a critic of the Syrian government and its prolonged presence in Lebanon. In a wave of protests that would become known as the Cedar Revolution, thousands pour into Martyrs Square, wrapped in Lebanon's colors, calling for an end to Syrian control over Lebanon. Under intense pressure, Syria pulls its troops out, ending a nearly 3-decade presence in the country. As Syria departs, voices calling for Lebanese sovereignty quickly shifted towards Hezbollah. The groundwork for this moment had been laid the year before. Resolution 1559, backed by the United States, called for the disarmament of militias and the sovereignty of the Lebanese state. While the resolution didn't explicitly name Hezbollah, it was clear who the target was.
Context of the transition that is going on here, that the Lebanese leadership fully understands its responsibilities to the full implementation of 1559, and that includes the disbandment of militias.
The Bush administration, emboldened by its invasion of Iraq, promoted this resolution as part of its broader vision for a new Middle East.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
For Hezbollah and many Lebanese, disarmament was out of the question. The group saw its weapons as essential for defending Lebanon, especially with Israel just over the border. The scars of Israel's invasions were still fresh, and the Shebaa Farms, a disputed strip of land seized in 1967, remains under Israeli control. A reminder of Hezbollah's unfinished business. But their goals weren't just territorial. For years, Hezbollah had called for the release of Lebanese prisoners held in Israeli jails. Meanwhile, Israel wasn't idle. Along the border, it carried out military drills, simulating strikes on Lebanese border towns. After its withdrawal from southern Lebanon in 2000, Israel was left with an uncomfortable reality. Hezbollah wasn't just a resistance movement anymore. It had grown into a formidable military force. The stage was set for what many believed was inevitable. The only question left was when the spark would ignite. July 12, 2006. 8 Israeli soldiers were killed and 2 were captured.
هول الأسرى الموجودين عنا لن يعودوا إلى الديار إلا بوسيلة واحدة، تفاوض غير المباشر والتبادل والسلام.
Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert rejected Hezbollah's offer, vowing that Israel would not negotiate with terrorists.
لكن إذا كان العدو الإسرائيلي يريد تصعيد ويفكر على طريقته بأنه بده يدفع لبنان أثمان، نحن جاهزون للمواجهة. وإلى أبعد ما يمكن أن يتصور هذا العدو ومن يقف خلفه. عليهم أن يتوقعوا المفاجآت.
The capture of the soldiers became the justification for a full-scale military response. But the speed and scale of Israel's reaction suggested that they had been waiting for this moment.
They both had different reasons, the State Department and the White House, for wanting Israel to do it, encouraging them to do it, supporting them. Our Air Force worked very closely with the Israeli Air Force for months before this, not necessarily with a deadline, knowing when it would happen. It was always going to be whenever there was an incident, they would take advantage of an incident.
Airstrikes targeted Beirut's airport to enforce a blockade on Lebanon and struck key infrastructure in the south. Bridges crumbled, highways turned to dust. The Second Lebanon War had begun. Hezbollah responded with rockets, targeting northern Israeli cities including Haifa. For the first time, the group demonstrated its ability to strike deep into Israeli territory. The attack shocked Israel, a reminder that this conflict was unlike any before. southern Lebanon came under relentless airstrikes. Buildings were flattened, and the Dahiyya neighborhood in Beirut, better known as Hezbollah's stronghold, was reduced to rubble. Whispers of Nasrallah's death spread rapidly, fueling the chaos. For tense, desperate days, it seemed like Hezbollah might not make it.
المفاجآت التي وعدتكم بها سوف تبدأ من الآن في عرض البحر في مقابل بيروت الباوجة الحربية العسكرية الإسرائيلية انظروا إليها تحترق وستغرق.
Hezbollah delivered a stunning blow. A missile struck an Israeli warship, while Nasrallah's taped message was broadcast on Hezbollah's television simultaneously. The next day, Hezbollah rockets struck deeper into Haifa. Civilians fled to bomb shelters as Hezbollah's Dahiyya for Haifa doctrine took shape. For every strike on Hezbollah's stronghold in Beirut, they would retaliate against Haifa and beyond. With the air campaign failing to stop Hezbollah's rocket attacks, Israel launched a ground offensive into southern Lebanon. Overconfident from its history of swift invasions,
we're going to get to go into Lebanon.
But the rugged terrain of southern Lebanon and Hezbollah's guerrilla tactics turned the operation into a nightmare. Israel's assaults became more violent. Civilian areas, including hospitals and residential zones, became targets in an attempt to pressure Hezbollah internally.
What we're seeing here, in a sense, is the birth pangs of a new Middle East. And whatever we do, we have to be certain that we're pushing forward to the new Middle East, not going back to the old one.
Calls for Hezbollah's disarmament, amplified by Resolution 1559, grew louder once again among Western
Hezbollah
leaders.
For almost 2 years has been fortifying and arming militia down in the south of Lebanon. In defiance of the UN Resolution 1559.
The best way to stop the violence is for Hezbollah to lay down its arms and to stop attacking.
As UN-brokered ceasefire talks were underway, Israel launched a final ground offensive, hoping to gain an advantage before the ceasefire took effect. The campaign's final chapter ended disastrously for Israel, deepening the sense of loss and frustration among its military and citizens. Finally, on August 12, after 33 days of brutal fighting, the UN-brokered Resolution 1701 called for a ceasefire, bringing the conflict to an end. Even though both sides claimed victory, the aftermath of the war unfolded in two contrasting narratives.
First it was Tunisia, then Egypt. Now the autocratic regime in Libya may be the next to fall. Anti-government protests are threatening the future of dictator Muammar Gaddafi, but his 42-year reign...
The year is 2011. The Arab Spring sweeps across the Middle East like wildfire, toppling governments and sparking protests fueled by dreams of freedom and change. But in Syria, the story takes a darker, bloodier turn.
President al-Assad has lost legitimacy, that he needs to step down.
What began a series of demonstrations against the government quickly spirals into chaos. Within weeks, chants in the streets give way to bullets and bombs.
A senior military officer in the Syrian city of Hama has defected along with up to 50 of his soldiers.
The defection of Syrian military fractures the nation into a patchwork of rival factions, rebel groups, extremist militias, and global powers, each pursuing their own agenda.
After careful deliberation, I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets.
As Syria descended deeper into turmoil, its instability began bleeding into Lebanon.
Religious war may be spreading beyond borders. Today, bombs exploded in Beirut, Lebanon.
Kidnapped in Lebanon
a group linked to Al-Qaeda is claiming responsibility for 2 suicide bomb attacks near the Iranian embassy in Beirut. Observers say the incident is a sign Syria's civil war is spilling over into
the rockets
Lebanon.
That fell on Hezbollah-controlled southern Beirut appear to be the first targeted attack on the Lebanese Shiite militia since the start of the Syrian conflict.
For Hezbollah, this wasn't just a distant war. It was a threat that was knocking on their door.
This is Iraq, this is Sham. But now, this is all one country, inshallah, one dawla, inshallah, one ummah, inshallah. There is no more border.
Militants in Iraq have declared the completion of their Islamic State with a new caliphate under their leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
There's a new player in the Syrian conflict.
Al-Nusra has pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda.
He joined Al-Qaeda. Hezbollah is moving troops into Syria.
من أجل لبنان وشعب لبنان والله من أجل كل اللبنانيين من مسلمين ومسيحيين وإذا احتاجت المعركة مع هؤلاء الإرهابيين التكفيريين أن أذهب أنا وكل حزب الله إلى سوريا سنذهب إلى سوريا.
Alongside the Syrian army, Hezbollah has helped them to win key victories against the Syrian rebels.
The stakes extended far beyond immediate security. For decades, the roads from Damascus had carried vital supplies from Iran, critical to Hezbollah's resistance against Israel. A shared sense of alarm drew Iran directly into the fray. The rise of ISIS and the al-Nusra Front wasn't contained within Syria. It rapidly spilled over into Iraq, advancing dangerously close to Iran's
borders.
The elite
Revolutionary Guard Quds Force is training, advising, and supporting Iraqi Shia militia led by General Qasem Soleimani.
The shadowy commander of the elite Quds Force is considered the architect of Iran's campaign against ISIS.
For both Hezbollah and Iran, intervention was not a choice, it was a necessity. Hezbollah's intervention in Syria alongside other forces in the axis of resistance successfully pushed back the extremist threat and secured its vital lifeline.
عيد التحرير الثاني في 28 آب 2017 وأبارك لكم هذا الانتصار العظيم على جميع الإرهابيين.
But the cost was steep. Their reputation in the Arab world declined as their involvement in a conflict defined by sectarian divisions cast a shadow over their narrative of resistance. The Syrian civil war forced Hezbollah to evolve into a larger, more expansive non-state military force, far beyond its original scope and reshaping its legacy in the process. Meanwhile, Israel watches from the sidelines, quietly benefiting as its longtime adversary expends resources and fractures its image. Following the Syrian civil war and shifting dynamics on the geopolitical chessboard, the region undergoes a new wave of transformation.
We mark the dawn of
called the
new Middle
Abraham
East.
Accords.
Several Arab states, brokered by US diplomacy, begin normalizing relations with Israel, sidelining the Palestinian cause.
But I believe that we are at the cusp of an even more dramatic breakthrough, an historic peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Southern Israel experienced a morning unlike any other. A sky dotted not with birds but with paragliders. But this wasn't a weekend adventure. It was a part of a planned military operation.
Operation Al-Aqsa Flood.
marking a dark day.
Sirens wail, and deep within the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian group Hamas launches a surprise attack, an all-in bid to assert their existence once more.
אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם.
Israel, with a green light from the US, responds with decisive force, targeting Gaza Strip with relentless airstrikes. Hospitals, schools, and refugee camps are caught in the crossfire, sparking widespread international condemnation.
Do you condemn what happened? Do you condemn Hamas? Yes or no?
Israeli commanders have been deployed all over Gaza.
Insisted that a ground invasion of Gaza
And now, as Gaza was burning, the big question was whether Hezbollah would open a second front, dragging Israel into a multi-front war.
A second Israeli front there, Hezbollah, which is far stronger than Hamas and could take this war into even more dangerous territory.
Just a day after the conflict began, Hezbollah fired rockets at Israel, not a full-scale attack, but a calculated signal of their presence.
Further north now, Hezbollah has launched rockets from southern Lebanon into northern
This wasn't a rush to war, it was a patient and deliberate strategy. As Israel directed its military might, ground troops, air force, and political efforts towards Gaza, Hezbollah ramped up its activity. By mid-November, Hezbollah had targeted over 120 Israeli positions with rockets and missiles. But this was just the beginning. Hezbollah's true objective was to stretch Israel's military capacity. Nearly 40% of Israel's military was now stationed along its northern border, leaving fewer troops available for the brutal fight in Gaza. Over time, Hezbollah's strikes became increasingly precise, targeting Israeli convoys, surveillance systems, and radar installations. The conflict quickly turned into a tit-for-tat exchange, each side responding with calculated force. With the situation growing more tense, it became clear that Israel could not handle a two-front war on its own. Israel turned to the US for support. They deployed 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to the Mediterranean Sea, hoping that the conflict wouldn't escalate further beyond control.
Has deployed the 5-ship USS Dwight D. Eisenhower strike group to the eastern Mediterranean Sea. It joins the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, which arrived.
They will be going initially across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean, where they will be available if needed.
In early December, the rhetoric from Israeli officials intensified. Israeli Defense Minister declared that Hezbollah must be pushed back behind the Litani River, aiming to recreate a buffer zone, a territory Israel had occupied for 22 years before its withdrawal in 2000. However, the plan didn't go as expected. On the ground, Hezbollah turned the table. The situation in northern Israel turned into a war of attrition, with missile strikes, rocket fire, and ambushes becoming the daily reality.
Visit northern Israel today and you find ghost towns such as Metula, Arab al-Aramsha, and Kiryat Shimona empty, except for soldiers deployed against Hezbollah.
Rather than pushing Hezbollah northward, Israel found itself creating an unintended buffer zone, not in Lebanon, but within its own territory instead. Nearly 6 months after the October 7th events, Israel finds itself in an increasingly difficult position. The war in Gaza, originally aimed at eliminating Hamas and rescuing hostages, has dragged on with no decisive victories. Israel's international standing has been damaged dramatically, facing broad international criticism, with accusations of genocide becoming more common. In the south, Yemen's Ansarullah have successfully disrupted Israel's access to global trade routes by targeting shipping lanes in the Red Sea.
Targeting what they say are Israeli-linked ships in the Red Sea.
By mid-April, Iran had joined the fray, directly striking Israeli territory.
A direct attack from Iranian soil
towards the State of Israel.
Facing challenges on multiple fronts, Israel reverted to one of its oldest and most reliable methods. This tactic was intended to shift the momentum back in their favor. Just a month after Iran's attack, a suspicious helicopter crash resulted in the deaths of Iran's president and foreign minister. While the incident was officially described as an accident, speculation soon arose regarding potential Israeli involvement, fueling controversy surrounding the tragedy. July 31st. After attending the inauguration ceremony of Iran's new president, Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, was assassinated in Tehran. That same night, Fuad Shukr, a senior Hezbollah commander, was assassinated in the Dahiyeh district of southern Beirut. With Israel targeting high-profile figures, many expected immediate retaliation from Iran, especially after crossing a critical line by striking Tehran's official guest. Yet behind closed doors, the US was urging Iran to hold its fire. Americans promised that a ceasefire in Gaza was imminent, a promise that, like many before it, went unfulfilled. Instead, it bought Israel more time to ramp up its assassination campaign. With the October 7th anniversary approaching in just a few weeks, Israel's assassinations have still not secured a victory. Netanyahu, facing immense domestic pressure following the deaths of more hostages, desperately needs a winning card.
Largest demonstration in Israel's history.
Are pressuring Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's
Israel's security cabinet now has to revise its strategy, focusing on the northern front. A victory over Hezbollah would not only facilitate the safe return of northern residents, but also restore some of Israel's lost deterrence. Israel's strategy took a darker and more ruthless turn, pushing the boundaries of conventional warfare.
Hezbollah members have been injured across Lebanon after their personal wireless devices exploded.
On September 17th and the following day, Israel executed an unprecedented series of cyber attacks, specifically targeting pages and walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah members and affiliates. The devices exploded simultaneously upon receiving triggered messages, resulting in civilian casualties and severe injuries, including many who lost their sight as the devices detonated while they were holding them. This harrowing method of attack sent shockwaves around the globe and spreading chaos and insecurity within the Lebanese people. In response to the attacks, Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah delivered a defiant speech, vowing that Hezbollah would not relent in its resistance until Israel ended its assault on Gaza.
السبيل الوحيد هو وقف العدوان والحرب على أهل غزة. هذا الطريق الوحيد. لن تستطيعوا أن تعيدوا سكان الشمال إلى الشمال. وافعلوا ما شئتم. وافعلوا ما شئتم.
But Israel wasn't finished. An Israeli airstrike targeted the Dahiyeh neighborhood in Lebanon, killing another key Hezbollah commander, along with other high-ranking members.
Senior military commander Ibrahim Akil was among those killed in Friday's Israeli attack.
Few days later, Israel launched a massive strike on southern Lebanon, leaving over 500 people dead, mostly civilians.
50 children.
These escalations has led to the onset of what is now being recognized as the Third Lebanon-Israel War. Hezbollah was under increasing pressure, and the calls for Iran's intervention grew louder. Israel, on a winning streak, aimed to finish the job. While attending the United Nations in New York, Netanyahu ordered the assassination of Hezbollah's Secretary General, Syed Hassan Nasrallah.
التبريكات للتعازي باستشهاد الأمين العام لحزب الله السيد حسن نصر الله.
Nasrallah has been killed in that bombing attack.
A significant blow to Hezbollah and the entire resistance movement in the region.
Hezbollah is not out, but it's really down. It's clobbered. Their leadership has been decimated.
Says it will continue the fight until Israel ends its war on Gaza.
Israel has notified the US it intends to launch a limited ground incursion into Lebanon.
First time since 2006, Hezbollah fighters have battled Israeli
Despite the setbacks, Hezbollah has demonstrated its capabilities to Israeli troops.
At least 4 Israeli soldiers have been killed, dozens more injured after Hezbollah drones hit an Israeli army base near
It says
Haifa.
it killed Hashem Safieddin, the presumed successor to Hassan Nasrallah, as leader of Hezbollah.
Israeli Security Cabinet agreeing to end the fighting with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Over the next 60 days, Israel will withdraw its troops after invading the country nearly 2 months ago.
Less than a day after the fragile ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, the region began to unravel in unexpected ways.
First time in 8 years, rebel forces have entered Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS.
From Idlib, the rebranded Takfiri militants seized their moment.
Really strategically began on the day that the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel went into effect.
Because they knew that the opportunity will close very quickly if Hezbollah and Shia militias take their breath again. And HTS saw an opportunity, and this is why they waited for signing the ceasefire, and they didn't put up the fight during the war for not them to be accused of helping Israel.
Cities fell one after another, and within days, Damascus found itself surrounded, a chilling echo of what many thought had been left behind in the Syrian civil war.
The rebel leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, described the victory as a historic moment.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus.
At the same time, Israel pushed deeper into Syrian territory, severing the vital logistical lifeline connecting Iran, Lebanon, and Palestine.
Israel has launched more overnight strikes on Syria, causing an explosion that was detected by earthquake sensors more than 800 kilometers away.
إذا سقطت سوريا في يد الأمريكي والإسرائيلي والتكفيري وأدوات أمريكا بالمنطقة اللي بيسموا حالهم دول إقليمية ستحاصر المقاومة، وسوف تدخل إسرائيل إلى لبنان لتفرض شروطها على اللبنانيين ولتحيي أطماعها من جديد ومشاريعها من جديد. إذا سقطت سوريا ضاعت فلسطين وضاعت المقاومة في فلسطين.
Hezbollah, long defined by its ability to adapt and resist, now found itself besieged on all sides. Back in Lebanon, old adversaries resurfaced. Christian factions, echoing decades-old calls, reignited demands for Hezbollah's disarmament. They amplified their accusations, claiming that Hezbollah's intervention in Gaza had only deepened Lebanon's instability.
إنه كل الضرر اللي ممكن يحصل على غزة واللي ممكن واحد يتصوره صار بغزة، وبالتالي يعني شو كانت فايدة العمليات العسكرية اللي انطلقت من جنوب لبنان؟
Yet despite the heavy blows Hezbollah endured, Israel's ambitions to re-enter southern Lebanon were met with fierce resistance. The days when Israeli forces could march toward Beirut in a matter of days were long gone. Even at its weakest and without its leadership, Hezbollah ensured that no Israeli boots remained on Lebanese soil. In Gaza, after 15 months of relentless conflict, Israel was forced to accept a ceasefire. For all its military might, Israel could not crush the Palestinian resistance.
The main objective in the war in Gaza was the annihilation of Hamas. That has not happened.
The ceasefire was more than a pause in fighting. It stood as a testament to the endurance of a people who refused to be erased. This ceasefire marked a victory for Palestinian resistance, one that would have been impossible without Hezbollah's sacrifices. The story of the resistance in Lebanon is not one of clean victories or absolute defeats. It is a story of survival, a movement that endured setbacks, weathered wars, invasions, and unending turmoil, yet refuses to fade away. As the dust settles once more, the resistance stands, wounded, but unbroken, and the fight is far from over.